Hello and welcome to my friend the Rainbow Circle, episode 54. I think it's 54. Um, yeah, 54 is half of 108. There's a good reason for that. So I'm trying something new. I have been making videos while waiting for my son to get out of school every once in a while, but I have to make them without the Rainbow Circle as a visual guide. Today I'm going to try. This may fail. I developed via trial and error. People call us pantsers, which is a terrible name. We need a better name for people who learn by trial and error and who just jump right into something. Pantsers is such a terrible, dismissive sort of a name. But I'm going to talk about Lost, and I think that is something that there's so many fascinating false criticisms of Lost. Lost, you can go into really, really in-depth analysis of, cognitive analysis of how people interpret things by looking at interpretations of Lost. It's fascinating. I've been thinking about it because I'm editing a story called Lost or Get Lost. It really has nothing to do with Lost, but I do love the show Lost, so I just stole the title. It's much more a reference to a show called Bo on the Go. Sort of looking at the dark underbelly of the implications of that show. But that's for another day. But Lost is a fascinating example of so many different metacognitive, analytical approaches and interpretation that you can go on and on, but just so many things. And I think it's a good example of how different interpretations land on different levels of the Rainbow Circle. Especially looking at the end, and I'm about to spoil it for my millions and millions and millions of viewers. Definitely watch Lost. It's a show that I love passionately. But the ending was very, very divisive. And I'll agree the last few seasons weren't the best written show, but I have a very different interpretation about what was the problem with them. Commonly, a lot of what I would hear when Lost went off the air was that was bad because it didn't explain anything. But I was a hardcore Lost fan, so I would hear that and I would say, actually, they explained everything. I had a hard time even pointing out one thing that they failed to explain. But I think that's a problem. They had no obligation to explain anything. Because another one of my favorite shows, Twin Peaks. I'll spoil Twin Peaks as well. Lost had some basic similarities with Twin Peaks. It was radically different in many ways, but a lot of the ways that they treated mystery, are fairly similar. The way they treated cliffhangers, for example, was similar. And so the criticism of Lost was they're just painting themselves into corners. They had no idea what direction the show was going. They have no plan to explain anything. They don't know what's actually going on. And they're just going show by show, writing for cliffhangers and twists, and they don't have an actual plan. Which is a false criticism. It's not a legitimate criticism of any sort of a story. You can have magnificent stories where there's no explanation. Look at Twin Peaks, for example. You can have fantastic shows. Arguably, Twin Peaks, if you talk about a plan and you narrow down your definition of what a plan is to just plot development and things like that, arguably it's not really a show where plans are even a relevant thing. Arguably, they probably were going show by show, looking at plot twists and things like that. Usually when people say, that only lasted 2 seasons, but it's widely regarded, most of the people I hear about Twin Peaks are hardcore fans. It's widely regarded as one of the most influential shows, certainly of the 90s, early 90s. It had a huge influence on me, that's for sure. But arguably where it went wrong is where it solved the murder. The first season, what was so compelling about it was set up as the single murder mystery And the whole show was dedicated to giving clues about this murder mystery. And so the fans would participate in trying to figure out the murder mystery. And according to David Lynch, he had no plans to really reveal who the murderer was. And that's totally 100% valid position an artist can take and should be totally validated and empowered to take. The way mystery functions in a text is to elicit visceral response. That's really the only function it has. Solving the mystery is eliminating that visceral response. And you can see that very clearly in season 2. I mean, that's the fascinating thing to look at in season 2. They solve the murder fairly early in season 2 of Twin Peaks. And then the show just has so little power. I mean, the characters were interesting. There were some really compelling characters. They're quirky and strange and fascinating. But a lot of that aspect of the show was so melodramatic, it was harder to connect. It's sort of short-circuited. I've talked about that melodrama before. That's not David Lynch's strong suit necessarily. But it was so melodramatic that it short-circuited our ability to, connect, feel what the characters are feeling. Except maybe like Dale Cooper, there were a handful of characters you could definitely, like Laura Palmer, there were a handful of characters you could definitely connect to more effectively. Not because they're realistic. I have very little in common with Dale Cooper, but I definitely connected with him and felt lots and lots of sympathy for him. And he was one of the less melodramatic of all of the characters. But after the solution of the murder, Dale Cooper really had no direction. The show had no direction. It was kind of just a soap opera, basically. And soap operas are great. It's just, not my preferred type of story. Nothing wrong with it. No criticism with soap operas. Just, and I think that was no longer a murder mystery. It was a soap opera. It was this huge schematic shift that a lot of people just dropped off after that. So there could be a whole series of episodes about Twin Peaks. It's such a complicated show. Then in season 3, the recent one, it came out not that long ago, 2 years ago, maybe 1 year ago. David Lynch corrected the mistake, what I would call a mistake, of explaining too much by creating this very complicated, deeply mysterious, baffling, incomprehensible masterpiece in season 3. And that was totally his right as an artist. You compare that to Lost. The fan experience, the common, really popular fan experience, where it was hugely popular in the first season for Twin Peaks and for Lost. The fan experience was trying to figure out what the mystery of the island was, or, who killed Laura Palmer. And your common fan sort of expectation of something like that is it's going to be a relatively easy explanation, and that it's essentially a contract with the reader or the viewer that an explanation will eventually come. Whether or not it comes is irrelevant, but it sort of sets up that schematic expectation that an explanation will eventually come. And so a lot of the speculation early on in Lost tended to be easily identifiable things, like they're in purgatory. I have that as one of my levels here. So let's take a look at my rainbow circle, my exploded rainbow circle. Let me see if I can actually get that in the shot. So the bottom part is the green part, which is the connection with the characters. I think that's something that Lost did much, much better than Twin Peaks. Twin Peaks had tons of really intense, visceral imagery, but in terms of connection with the characters, that you had Dale, you had a handful of other characters, depending on my notebook's gonna fall to pieces. Depending on who you really liked in Twin Peaks, there's a lot of really likable characters. A lot of them are just really, really over the top, but Dale and a handful of others. But Lost had, was great. In my entirely subjective opinion, it was great at creating just a large number of really compelling, emotionally stimulating characters. Most of them you cared about. Charlie and Saeed and Hugo and later Ben Linus and Jack, not so much. I grew to really hate Jack, but Cade and Sawyer. Sawyer, was a bit harder to love, but and Locke. Locke was really my favorite. Locke and Ben were really my two favorites. But it has so many characters that were just really compelling and drew you in to be, characters that you love. And so it was really good at that. And part of what really made that effective is the marriage between level 1 and level 2, the paradoxical and the visceral. Maybe I should hold on that just a little bit longer. The paradoxical and the visceral. So the paradoxical, the whole show was just set up as a paradox. So you would get the superficial impressions of a character, and then you would get these flashbacks that contradict your really superficial impressions. And that was the nature of the show. And that was the emotional drive of the show. How are they different off of the island from on the island? How did the island highlight these fantasy versions of themselves or these idealized versions of themselves? How did that island experience force them to be these more heroic versions of themselves, or more intensely violent versions of themselves? What have you? Like Mr. Echo is a fantastic example. How did the island turn him from this really violent guy into a much more intensely religious guy? Just as a basic example right there. What the show was moving towards was schematic, but it was internally schematic. So a lot of people this is level 3, schematic. Level 3, there you go. Schematic. The mythology of the two brothers. And it's unsatisfying in a way. And I would argue that it's unsatisfying for really casual viewers who didn't quite care as much about the characters and weren't as invested, because they wanted some sort of simple explanation of the mysteries. What is the island? Oh, it's purgatory, or it's aliens, or something like that. For me, it's unsatisfying, not because it's bad. I mean, it works for the story, but it's unsatisfying because it explains away the visceral power of the mystery to the detriment of the characters to a basic degree, because they're pawns. I mean, that's just the nature of the mythology of the two brothers. They're pawns in the war between these two brothers, and it's kind of okay, kind of a lame mythology. It's The Stand. They said it was influenced by The Stand, and The Stand is fine. Not my favorite sort of story. I don't always love really dualistic stories, but that's my taste. So if you apply to that the post-rationalization, this is, I talked about post-rationalization. This is a prime example of post-rationalization really based on no evidence at all. The post-rationalization a lot of people applied to it was that this must be bad because it didn't explain everything. It explained absolutely everything, really, but it explained it based on the mythology of the two brothers, Jacob and the man in black. And I'm guessing people who said it didn't explain anything were just unsatisfied by that explanation. And then in season, the last season, season 6, you had a really complicated narrative trick that they were playing, where half of that season was in purgatory. And so people took what you could call purgatory. So people took that half of season 6 and took the simplest version of that explanation and applied it to the whole show. And they were offended that the creators said it's not purgatory. And they got offended. I mean, this is just a common criticism I would hear. They got offended that the creators just lied to us. They didn't lie. That half of the last season was in purgatory. The rest of the show wasn't in purgatory. If you need a more complicated explanation of how that works, just let me know. But it was a really complicated narrative trick that they were pulling to make half of one season in purgatory. But the rest of it is a mythology that is unsatisfying, and I think that was a big factor in why people rejected it. But the explanation they give had really no evidence. It was not an actual explanation. That's not an actual narrative problem to say that. One, it's not a narrative problem to say that the creators didn't explain anything. That's just not true. It's also not a narrative problem to say for any creator not to explain anything. Writers, any kind of creator, has no obligation whatsoever to explain anything. So that's my main point. I can go into more detail about Lost, but I think I gotta move my car in just a second. But let's take a look at the Rainbow Circle. Look at the other levels, because I don't really explain the other levels, and I really have no reason to. I mean, I don't really find them useful personally, but I think the show really succeeded. If you look right at the end, that's a lot of the positive response. Right at the end, it succeeded in serving the characters. It was cheesy. The ending in the church was very cheesy. I would say that would be a valid criticism to say, oh, the church scene, it was kind of corny. I like corny things, and I wouldn't say that's a universal negative, but, just personally, it was a little on the cheesy side. But it served the characters really well. It was just a great capping of the character arcs and everything like that. So it succeeded on level 1, 2, and 3. It succeeded in being a great character story, a great paradoxical story, and a great schematic story. The schematic was the weaker part, but it worked just fine. But people wanted it to be, they wanted it to be easier to dismiss. So the mysteries were so good that it created this sense of unfulfilled danger, mystery, visceral impact, and they had this gut level desire to reduce that visceral impact with a relatively easy explanation and a destimulating explanation. That's basically how stories work. The drive towards destimulation is the actual drive of the story and heightens the actual stimulation, and receiving that destimulation is the end of the story. So receiving an explanation for mystery is the end of the story. So they, a lot of them wanted it to be in everybody's head. The psychological. If you can read my handwriting's terrible. This may be a terrible idea. This is how pantsers work. I may realize in the middle of it that my handwriting is too bad, and this might be a terrible idea, and that I have to move my car pretty soon. But they want it to be all in their head. They want it to be a metaphor for something in reality, like the post-9/11 stuff. You'll hear that interpretation every once in a while. Like it's a plane crash in 2004, so it's a response to social paranoias and stuff like that. And that's a valid interpretation, but it's not, from an artist's perspective, it's not the most valuable thing about the text. The most valuable thing being how effectively it serves the characters, and it did just fine there, in my opinion, because I do like the show. The representational, you have things like purgatory. People want the destimulating effect of recognizing that from right at the beginning that it's purgatory. And that is something that, it would have explained things right from the beginning, but if we had just established that right up front, it would have eliminated the mystery part of it. And it would have been destimulating. But that's what really drives people into the show, is trying to find some sort of factor that destimulates it, like a clear explanation that it's purgatory. But if the show keeps going and eliminates that as an explanation and keeps the mystery, stimulating and compelling, then it's a successful show. Explaining right up front that it was purgatory would have been, a huge mistake. And then rhetorical. The rhetorical is a common sort of, I'll hold it up there. Rhetorical is fine. I talked about this in the last episode, how universalization is a bit of a pet peeve. We like Locke because Locke's experience is the experience that we all go through. I've never been a survivalist. I've never been in a wheelchair. I don't think that's the reason I like Locke. I have some basic personality similarities for sure. I was told I was very similar to Ben, which is very terrifying because he's a murderer. I have some basic personality similarities, so maybe that's why I like them the most. But I really don't have the whole lot in common with most of the characters. So that's not really saying that it's a universal experience that teaches me how to, seek redemption for sins of my past or something like that. That's the most destimulating end of the spectrum and the least compelling of all of the explanations, and the least efficient. So a much more accurate, arguably, and more efficient, arguably, and a better way to honor the artistic integrity of the creators, I would say, is just to say Locke is a great character, and I felt what he felt, and his experience was so intense that it made me feel these intense feelings. The mystery was so compelling that it made me feel these intense feelings. Whether or not it's universal is irrelevant. So, that being said, definitely watch Lost. Season 1 is amazing. One of the most perfect seasons of a TV show. It's a little bit faulty elsewhere, and a lot of it is basic structural stuff. But the faults that Lost had, I love the whole series, but the faults that Lost had are not in its lack of explanation. It explained everything. And lack of explanation is not even a real criticism. Those are my main points. So, see you on the next episode.